Hi everyone, in this tutorial we'll be creating an explosion using mainly EmberGen and Nuke. What we have here is already quite a nice video, but it does feel like there's missing something. So let's add an explosion to it. Before we start, I'll have a quick look at the Nuke project settings by hitting S in the node graph. Make sure your frame rate, frame range and resolution is set correctly. Now we have to decide on what moment we want our explosion to occur. Maybe right about here, just before I leave the screen. Something I like to do is to use a rotor paint node and sketch out where you want the explosion to be. Make sure you're on single frame mode. So just scratch in a couple of frames. This way you'll get a nice idea of how the timing will turn out. So I think this will work pretty well. I'll write this frame down in a sticky note so I'll know where I want my explosion to start later on. The idea I had in mind for this shot was to do a big gunpowder explosion. So I gathered some references for it. Making a collage like this can be very helpful to look at while working. So analyzing this, we can see we'll need a big puff of white smoke made up of a couple of mushroom type shapes, and we can see that the fire is more of a flash that will burn off very quickly. When working with a collage like this, it's also good to pick a main reference. I'll pick this one here, since I think this one has the best scale. This one, for example, is reaching way over the trees, which won't really work for my framing in this shot. Now, just before we go to EmberGen, let's export a background plate, which we can use in the EmberGen camera. I'll create a write node. Since it's a static camera, it doesn't really matter what frame I pick, so I'll just pick the last one. Make sure your reference image is clear to see. This one is way too flat, for example, so I'll grade that a bit. Since it's only a reference, I like to use something small, like a JPEG. And now I'll render just the last frame. Okay, let's go to EmberGen. So the default preset doesn't really look like an explosion, so let's start by plugging a burst node into the emitter. This node will spawn some shapes that will also disappear quickly to create a nice burst of emission. Let's increase the fuel rate to get a real explosion out of this. When doing a shot like this, it can be helpful to keep a bunch of S's in mind, which are scale, shape, speed and shading, somewhat in that order. So let's try and get our scale right first. Scale in EmberGen is determined by the size of things. A radius of 0.5 obviously looks smaller than a radius of 2. But there's also the illusion of scale, which comes with more detail. Since increasing the bounding box costs a lot of performance and is limited depending on your graphics card, it's a good practice to try to get as much detail as possible out of the smallest bounding box possible. What you can do is drag off the forces pin of the simulation node and create a noise force. I'll set it to 2 here, since I think that's the smallest you can go for getting some nice detail. When turning this on and off, you can see it's already making the explosion look a lot bigger without us changing the actual voxel count. To prevent the noise from smearing the whole effect over time, you can keyframe the amplitude. By clicking on the circle to the left of it, it will create a keyframe on your timeline. If it doesn't automatically, you can go to Settings, Preferences, and check Create Key when parameter exposed. Or you can just double click on the timeline to make a keyframe. I'll animate it here from 4 to 0.5. If you're already using a build with this masking tab, you can actually use another method without keyframes. So I'll get rid of those. Here a constant mask of 100 means the noise will work in the regular way, applying the effect over all channels at all time. But if I set this to 0 and the temperature mask to 100, it will only apply the noise through the temperature, not smearing the smoke out. It's not really doing much now, so let's go even higher than 100%, like 1000. Let's try to get a little bit more detail into it by adding some velocity mask. Bit more temperature mask. Yeah, I think this works well. Now we can try and match this to our plate. I'll go to the camera here and click Use Camera. You can also use this drop down to go to camera 1, which is the camera that's plugged into the render node. The aspect ratio can be set in the display tab. I'm using a 16:9 aspect ratio, so any one of these will do. Now let's load in the backplate we created by checking this and using the import backplate parameter. To match the scale of the shot, I'll move the camera around to a point where I feel the scale looks correctly in this shot. This seems to align pretty good. We might need to tweak it later though. It's also a pretty bad idea to just work in untitled, so let's save our scene as well. It's a good idea to have your project file name end with something like _01 so you can easily increment it later. Now we have a good starting point for our scale. Let's continue working on the shape of our effect. The shape of an explosion is mostly determined by the emission, so let's tweak our burst node a bit. The default shape for a burst node is a sphere, but there are a couple of other shapes you can use. For a shot like this I like to use hollow sphere, which looks like a sphere but is actually hollow inside. A hollow sphere will emit a lot less of course, so let's increase the size and the fuel rate in the emitter. I'm using a hollow sphere for it will create empty space in the middle, which will result in the smoke rolling over itself a bit more, which we can see in a reference as well. Another way to increase this effect is to add some large vorticity intensity. I'll set that to 25, just like the normal vorticity intensity. I also want to adjust the spawn positions of these burst shapes, which you can do in the Positions tab. The distribution shape now is ellipsoid random, which means that the shapes will spawn within an ellipsoid with these parameters. To visualize it, it would spawn in a shape like this, which would be mostly over the XY plane. But what I want is a more longer shape shooting upwards. So what I'll do is increase the extend on Z-axis a lot, which will result in half of the shape spawning below the ground, which will give us a lot less emission. We can account for this by adding more shapes or moving the burst node up. The time between the spawning of these shapes is too long, which will result in having multiple explosions instead of just one. So what I'll do is turn the burst duration down, which is the time it takes for all the shapes to spawn, giving me more like a singular explosion. Another thing I want to do is set the trigger order to Z-axis upwards, which will mean that the lower shapes will spawn first and the higher shapes will spawn last. It's a bit hard to see actually with this short burst duration, so now you can see that the lower shapes will spawn first. I'll set this back down. I think we can use a bit more shapes, giving us a lot more emission as well. Another thing I might want to tweak is the size distribution, which will result in the big and small shapes to be distributed randomly in space, which actually results in a lot bigger shapes in this case, so I'll turn the initial radius down. And I think we're getting a really nice shape. Maybe it can go a bit higher even. Another thing that will make a lot of difference for an effect like this is to turn on blocking Z-ground in the Force tab of the simulation node. This will have the smoke stick a bit more to the ground. Another good thing to keep in mind when working on something like this is what is the biggest difference between this and my reference. In our case I would say that the smoke should be white and that the fire should last way shorter and the smoke way longer. The disappearing of density over time is called dissipation, which we can get to in the Dissipation tab. It's not here by default, but if you go to Combustion, Advanced Parameters, the Dissipation tab will show up. Here I'll turn the temperature dissipation way up to like 85% and the smoke dissipation way down to 2%. And as you can see, the smoke will stay way longer now and the fire disappears very quickly, just as in our reference. Let's change the color of the smoke to white, which we can do in the Smoke tab of the Shading node. What I like to do for something like this is to turn this all the way to white and then adjust the directional light to get the brightness I like. Our light angle isn't really matching actually, so I'll have a look at our plate again and set it to more of a top lighting like this scene. Now this blue color in the ambient light is showing a lot, so I'll tweak that a bit to more of a warm greenish color. We might have ended up with a bit too much smoke, so we can't really turn the smoke much down in the emitter since it's already barely emitting any smoke here. The smoke we see is actually generated by the combustion, which can be tweaked in the simulation node. If I turn the extinction smoke gain parameter to 0 in the combustion tab, you can see we lose all the smoke. So I'll turn this to like 10%. This might be a good time to look at our speed, so let's make a preview. In the render node, I'll check the render all capture type and I'll link an export node to that. Just set it to RGB, the export mode to sequence, and the file path to a location on my hard drive where I want my preview images to be. What I'm using here is the $project variable, which will give all the files the name of the project file I'm exporting from. Another handy thing you can do is use another backslash and put $project in there again. This will put all the images nicely into a subfolder with the name of the .ember file. Next, I'll set the number of frames to 100 and the frame stride to 3. Since EmberGen runs in 60 Hz and we want to export our effect to a 25 frames per second timeline, usually a frame stride of 2 or 3 will give a more realistic speed. 720p should be fine for a preview. Let's increase our bounding box to fit the scene better. And let's do an export. Looking at the preview we exported here, there are still some things we might want to adjust. The good thing about doing a preview like this is that you actually get to watch your effect in the correct frame rate. Now I get to see that my explosion is moving a bit too slowly. Looking at our reference, we can see that we're still missing this strong upward force in the beginning. Also, the scale doesn't seem quite correct. This shape is somewhat similar to this shape we have here on our reference. Here you can see it's about the size of a tree, which means that this effect should actually look a lot bigger. So as you can see, even if you were to do your shape and shading perfectly, if your scale and your speed is off, it's still not going to look very realistic when trying to integrate it to a live action plate. So let's try to address these things in EmberGen. Let's first take a look at our scale problem. What I'll do here is make my burst shape a bit bigger in the initial radius. Now I'll just let it simulate up until this point perhaps. And now if I move the camera closer, the scale of the effect should actually make more sense. We'll probably tweak this later. I would also like to add a bit more noise to this, so I'll go to velocity mask, set it to 500. And I'll set the smoke mask to -500, which will prevent the smoke from smearing out even more. Now let's add the strong upwards force for the initial explosion. So what you can do is plug forces into the emitter as well, which will result in the force to be only added within our burst shape in this case. So I'll add a line force and set this to something high like 100. This is giving quite an interesting effect, making our explosion a lot thinner. So what I might try is just make our burst shapes a bit bigger. The bigger explosion has some nicer detail, I think. It's still a bit too stretched out now by this line force, so I'll turn that down a bit. Let's try 70. Maybe 50. I think it's still rising a bit too much after the initial explosion. That's probably due to the buoyancy, so I'll turn that way down. With that turned down, we might want to add a bit more of that line force. Now let's have another look at how our scale is doing. I think we can move our camera back a little bit now. Somewhere over here. Another thing I would like to add is a shockwave. So let's create another emitter and set the emission to only smoke. So I'll turn fuel off and temperature off. And I'll set the smoke rate to like 1000. Let's turn show emitter on so we can see what we're doing. And for the shape input I'll use another burst node. And this time we'll set it to ring. What I'll do is turn my explosion emitter off for now, so we can clearly see what our shockwave emitter is doing. The first obvious problem is that this ring is way too small and we only need 1 instead of 3. So I'll set the amount of shapes to 1, and I'll set both these radii to like 20. That's a bit too much perhaps. Maybe 10. That seems like a good size to begin with. Let's turn our explosion emitter back on. So our shockwave is appearing way too late now, so we can tweak that using the burst duration in this case. You can also change the speed of this ring expanding by using the range of shapes duration. So if you want it to appear quicker, you can lower these values. What I'll do next is add a line force to this emitter. And instead of using push strength, we'll use repel strength. So there will be a strong outwards force creating this shockwave look. Maybe even higher. That's probably too much, but it is giving a cool effect. A nice rule for working with parameters is just break it and bring it back. So if a value of 100 doesn't seem to do too much, don't try 200, but just try 1000. And if it goes extreme, you know in what kind of range you're working. I'm going to change my bounding box shapes a bit so we can more clearly see what we're doing. To give this shockwave a more realistic shape, I'm going to blend it with a noise shape. So I'll reset and go to a frame where we can see our ring. About here. Maybe turn the fire and smoke off so we can more clearly see what we're doing. To blend this with a noise, what you'll have to do is create a blend shape and a noise shape. Then I'll put my burst shape into shape A and my noise shape into shape B. I'll connect the blend shape to my shapes input on the shockwave emitter and disconnect this input from the burst node. Now you can see our burst shape is blended with a fine noise. Let's create some big details by scaling the noise up. To add some smaller noise on top of this, you can add some octaves, which are smaller noises scaled down by the factor of the linearity value. The gain here determines the amplitude of the consecutive noises, so you might want to turn that up in this case. Let's turn the fire and smoke back on. And as you can see, we have a way more interesting shockwave shape now. I think we're still emitting a bit too much smoke for the shockwave. So what you can do to lower emission when using a noise shape is go to the noise, and I'll go to a frame where we can see this shape. And turn the bias up to have less shape, so less emission, and down to have more shape, more emission. I'm also going to adjust this burst shape a bit, since it's too much of a ring and I want it to be more of a disc. So to do that, you can turn the relative width up. And I'm also going to lower it a tiny bit. This gives us way more emission again, so to dial that back, we can adjust our noise bias. We may have lost too much of that ring shape now, so I'll turn the scale down. And increase the bias even further, since this shockwave is still a bit much. Even less, I would say. And then I go somewhere in between. Alright, I think this looks like a good shockwave. I'll turn the show emitter off again. Next up, what I want to do is add some debris, which I'll import from an exploding ball simulation I made. You can download this file via the link in the description if you like. So let's create an import node. And you can use the asset file path parameter to find your alembic fpx or obj file. After importing my file, I'm not really seeing anything, but that's probably because it's too small. So I'll click fit scale to simulation here. Well, that's way too big, but at least we know where our ball is. So in the master scale, I'll set it back to 100. That seems to be a way better scale. Now I'm going to tweak my camera a bit to align it with the bomb. It should be something like this. Now I can fine tune the scaling here. I'm also going to turn loop animation off since we only need this to explode once. For the speed of this, it's again a matter of doing previews, going back and forth. But since I already did this, I'll just put in the numbers I know will work, which is 60 FPS. You can override the FPS using this checkbox. And I'll animate the speed from 70% in the beginning to 90% around here. So my debris is exploding a bit too early. You can change this by going to global transform and tweak the time offset. I'll set it to 0.1. So higher values will have the animation start later and lower values will have the animation start earlier. In the reference we can see that our debris is leaving some smoke behind in the beginning. So let's add that by adding another emitter and turn everything off again except for the smoke. So now we can see the debris is leaving some smoke behind. It's a bit too faint though, so I'll add some more smoke in the emission tab. That's looking pretty nice. Maybe some noise will help to break this up a bit. I'll use a scale of 4 and an amplitude of like 50. Let's try that. Yeah, I like that. Maybe a bit much. Okay, so let's now animate the smoke rate. So all the way at the beginning I actually want it to be 0. I'll set it to timeline override. Then at this point I'm setting it to 100. And I think here I'll set it back to 0. So now you can see it's not emitting in this sort of run-up time. Actually move this over a bit. Then it turns on to 100% and then the tails fade off. Another thing that's present in most real world cases is wind. What I ended up doing for this shot is add a line force and a noise force. So what I'll do to make it more clear is add a comment to this using Ctrl G and I'll name this wind. We can actually change the color here as well to make it even more visible. So I'll start with the line force and I'll set it to -90 here so the wind is pushing from right to left. The push strength in this case will be the strength of our wind. This is also something you have to go a bit back and forth with to do previews and get the perfect speed. I'll set it to 0.015. We're applying this over the whole simulation now, so the effect will be pretty strong, thus the low value. To make the wind less uniform, I'll set the fall off to linear and the fall off distance to 50. I'll move this up a bit. So I'll go to my default perspective now to show this. What I have here is actually a very big cylinder for this line force. Using this fall off will make the force stronger in the middle of the cylinder and fade out towards the outside of the cylinder. Now for this wind noise I'll set the scale very big, like 80. The octaves to 3 to add some smaller detail into it. I'll turn this gain up a bit and the amplitude way down. I also noticed some issues for our floor here since it feels a bit offsetted. I'll fix that by adding a collider and just putting a big box into it. This way I can just crop that issue out. Now I want my imported geometry to sit right on the floor and I'll adjust my camera accordingly. So I'll put this floor a bit more into perspective, turn it off so I can see where I need to place my sphere. Okay, this might be a good time to do another preview. So I want to make sure I'm not cropping the top off like here, so I'll add some more voxels to the z-axis. And we might need a little more voxels on the x-axis as well. Now let's go to our export node again. I'll use a little more frames this time. And if you're still using this method with the variables, where your files in subfolder are named after your .ember file, make sure you've incremented it. I have it at 0.2 already here. So our preview is looking quite nice, so I think we can set up our render. Back in EmberGen, let's go to the render node and make sure you're on the capture types tab. Capture types are the different methods of capturing the images. In other software they're also known as AOVs or render passes. To preview these you need to go to the render tab So the capture types I want to have for this shot are render, which is the render of the effect without things like backplates. Next I want to have direct light. If you want to export a capture type, you'll have to check it here, and then the output pins for it will appear on the render node. So the direct light is all the light on the smoke contributed by the directional light. I also want ambient light, which is all the light coming from the ambient light. So let's check it here. Next I want emissive for the flames, and scattering for the light coming off the flames. I'll also need an alpha channel to determine the transparency. Then for my debris I want to use render shapes. So let's check that here too. And I'll also need an alpha for that, so let's check alpha shapes as well. And the last one I want to add is 6 point. This capture type can be used in compositing as a mask for the specific sides of the effect. Now let's set up this export node. I'll add _ $capture type to the file name. This way we'll have the capture type name embedded into the file name. And for this render I'm going to use EXR instead of PNG. The nice thing about EXR is that it has a larger dynamic range. To make use of this you'll have to turn on HDR. I'll turn it on for all of them except for the render all, since that's just a preview. Now for the image size I'll use the image size of my comp, which in this case is 2688 by 1512. Now let's determine what our number of frames should be. So we have our explosion starting at frame 375 and our timeline goes up to frame 611. So for number of frames you can just do 611 minus 375. But what I like to do is add a little more frames just to be sure, so we can shift the timing a bit in compositing if you need to. Now with this done, let's copy and paste all of our export nodes to connect all of our capture types. So to link them up quicker, what you can do is select this, then Control select the render node and use Control L to auto link them. For the render one I actually want to add the alpha channel, so I'll set it to RGBA here. And then I'll connect the alpha to render alpha. Now I'm going to paste another export node, connect it to the direct light, another one connected to the ambient light. For these shapes I'll also set it to RGBA and then connect the alpha shapes to the alpha channel. For 6 point it's a bit trickier since we need to hook up 6 channels. So for this one I'm going to add another variable to the name, which is $components. This will add right, left, top, bottom, back and front to the file name, which is handy for us to know in compositing. It will also prevent these two export nodes from overriding itself. Let's select all these export nodes, right click and select export all, or you can use this export all button. This might take a while since we're exporting a lot of capture types with a higher resolution. Now let's import the render passes we made into Nuke by hitting R in the node graph and selecting all of them. Now I'll get rid of these render all ones to be a bit more clear. To tidy this up you can select all of them and hit L on the keyboard to put them next to each other. Let's start with compositing our smoke now. In this case our smoke comes in two components, which is the direct light and the ambient light, which have to be merged together using a plus operation. So I'll set the operation to plus. We also need an alpha for this smoke, which in our case we put in our render capture type. So I'll put that here for now, create a copy node by hitting K on the keyboard. This will copy the alpha from this file into our smoke RGB, which doesn't have an alpha yet. So as you can see there's no alpha now, and if I go past the copy node, we put the alpha channel from this file in. Now this alpha needs to be pre-multiplied, so I'll create a pre-mult node. Now I'll just move it over a bit and merge it to our plate. Now the first thing I want to do is set my timing right, since now it's starting at frame 1 and we actually want it to start at frame 375. So I'll go to that frame first, then pick one of these and set frame start at 375. Now as you can see it starts about 7 frames later, so I actually have to set this to 368. Now don't forget to set all your other files to start at 368 as well. If you have a lot of files, this might be a bit tedious, so I actually made a script for that. It's just a couple of lines of Python code, so if anyone wants it, you can just ask in the comments. Now next up is that the grading is obviously way off. So let's start by getting that roughly in a better range by using a grade node here. Make sure to put all your grade nodes before the pre-multiplication. A handy way to match the brightness is to go to your element. Then in the grade node, click on this square for the white point. Now you can sample a color, so I'll just sample the brightest color. To see what it is, I'll actually turn my gamma down. So this all seems to be very bright. Then go to your plate and click the square next to the gain to sample something for that. And then just pick a bright color here. So I might do this thingy. Now let's have a look. Well, there's still a lot to tweak, but we're not blown out anymore, which is good. The smoke still looks too dark and contrasty, so let's increase the gamma. Something like this. Now I'll show a cool compositing trick where we can use the 6-point lighting for. To sort of create the illusion of global illumination from the ground in this case, what you can do is take this 6-point capture type. This is the bottom, back, front one. So bottom will be the first channel, which is red. Then I'll just create a grade node. And I'll set the lift and gain both to the ground color. Then I'll plug the mask into the 6-point file. And set this to RGBA red. What you can see now is that the bottom of the smoke is inheriting the color of the ground. Make sure you keep this very subtle though, so I'll mix it down in the grade node here. As you can see, using this in a subtle way can help the integration a bit. Comparing it to our reference, the small detail in our smoke seems to be a bit too contrasty. So what we can do is to try to fake some sort of subsurface scattering using a blur node. Then I'll set this to just RGB and blur the color channels out to about 50, I think. I don't like how this is darkening the edges though, which is a result of the outside color bleeding in because of the blur node. So what I'll do is take this alpha. Let's move some nodes around first. Create a clamp node. Then I'll just pick the minimum like this. I don't want that bluish tint actually, so I'll turn the saturation down. And then I'll plug the mask of the clamp node into our alpha channel. Now just invert the mask. And as you can see, our edges are a bit brighter again. And it's also boosting this very faint smoke, which is nice. Now again, let's keep it subtle and mix our blur node down. Now let's move on to compositing our fire. Let's make a backdrop for our smoke part. And let's continue to compositing our fire. So I'll take the scattering and the emissive capture types, move them over. Let's go to a frame where we can see our fire. Like this one. So first these two need to be added together as well, using the plus operation. And since it's light, I'll need to use the plus operation again here. Now my fire is also coming in way too bright and contrasty, so I'll add a grade node similar to the one I did for the smoke. Now this fire seems to have values around 60, so I'll set the white point to 60 and I'll turn the gamma up to 3. Now let's add some glow by putting another merge node here, setting it to either plus or screen. I'll try screen first. So coming from the same fire element, I'll add a blur node here and set this to like 50. You can tone it down a bit in the mix of the merge node. Now let's add another bigger one. You can select a couple of nodes and then hit Alt-C to copy and paste them. So instead of 50, I'll do 500 for this one. giving us a nice big glow. And I'll add one more, setting the blur to like 2000. So what we can see in our reference is this very bright flash, especially in this one, it goes real crazy. And here it's also very bright. In our reference it seems to build up in like 3 frames and then fades off in about 10 frames, so let's try that. Due to the way I set this up, this should actually be quite easy. So I'll add a multiply node just after this grade node. Set a keyframe here. 3 frames further I'll turn that way up, like 50 or 30 perhaps. And then 10 frames later I'll just set that back to 1. Nice and flashy. It does seem like the flash is a bit too lengthy though, so what I'll do is go to this multiply node, and after this highest point I'll go 1 frame later and turn it down a lot, maybe just 10. So that works a lot better, I think. Not quite sure what's happening down here. I think that's because I forgot to set my ground cube to hold out. An easy technique to fix these kind of things is just create a multiply node, then create a rotor node by hitting O on the keyboard, mask around the thing you want to remove, and just set the multiply node to 0. Another thing I don't like are these first couple of frames. So what I'll do is just get rid of the first 2 using a multiply node. So I'll set that to 0 here and to 1 here. I don't really like the shape of these first frames either, so what I'll do is add some displacement to it. So this is a gizmo I made. What it's basically doing is taking a noise, plugging that into the forward channel, and using iDistort to distort over that noise. So let's turn the size down and just animate that off from 50 to 0 10 frames later. Let's blur this out a bit in the beginning as well. Again, setting a keyframe here and then turning it off 10 frames later. Looking better. Let's add another grade for some more light interaction. So I'll put that below my elements. I'll just pick this color to be quick. Add a mask to this. Now we just have to sort of imagine where the light would hit, which would be the ground here, these bushes, and maybe some of these trees. I'm just sketching this in very roughly. Now just blur this mask out by a lot. 400 seems good. And now I'll just animate the mix to match my explosion. So let's start at 0, a couple frames later, 0.5, and let's just fade that off over 10 frames again. Maybe some more, I'll move that in the dope sheet. I think I'm lining up the ground way too much actually, so what you can do is go to the rotor node, just pick the ground one, and turn the opacity down here. Okay, now let's continue by adding our debris. I'll add that before the smoke and the fire. Let's call this fire, by the way. You can just add this using a merge node, leaving it on over this time. Some of this debris in the background doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, so let's add a mask to this merge node. I'll set it to invert and then cut these bushes out. Now let's have a look at the grade of this debris. So I'll create an unpremold and a premold node, and in between I'll add a grade node. First I'll start by taking the saturation out. Now for this grade node, let's just pick some colors of this balm. And let's also add a little blur to this. Maybe 2. Mix it down a bit. Now for this debris I also want to add some motion blur. So I'll create a motion blur node. I don't want this to be too crazy, so something like 0.2 should be fine. Another thing we're still missing here is some shadow of the ground cast by the smoke. So let's go back to EmberGen and create a shadow pass. To create a shadow pass, let's go back to this collider we made and turn the visibility on. Now I'll go to the render tab and select shadow shapes so we can preview our shadow capture type. So this is looking good, I think, but I don't really want this debris to be in here, so I'll go to my import node and I'll turn render as polygons off in the other tab. Now the debris is only casting shadows but not showing up in this capture type. Now let's select the capture type in the render node and copy and paste one of these export nodes to set up the render for this. We only need one channel for the shadow shape, so I'll set the component mode to just R and I'll connect it to shadow shapes here. Now compositing this smoke on should be very easy, so I'll go all the way to the top of my node tree, loading my shadow pass, and I'll merge this in using a multiply operation. And now we can see it's actually chopped off on the side, so let's go back to EmberGen and let's increase my bounding box in the x-axis. Just to make sure we don't see this cropping off anymore. So I'll increase the scale of this box too. This should be fine, I don't really mind this grass bit here. So let's export this again. And overwrite. Now we can just reload this file here. Fixing the cropping issue. Now we probably don't want the whole screen to be red, so I'll fix that using a shuffle node. And shuffle the red channel into the green and the blue channel as well. Also don't forget to set this start frame as well. We use 368 for the other ones. And now we have a nice shadow pass. What I want to do is soften this and dial it down. So I'll add a blur node, mix it down a bit. And I'm also going to turn the mix way down. I think we should keep it really subtle since we don't have very hard sunlight or anything like that. Explosions usually destroy things, so let's start by getting rid of this balm at our explosion frame. So I'll sort of branch off here and I create a merge node. Now I shot this clean plate, so just a shot from the same camera angle without the balm. Then I'll create a roto node, a pre-mold node. I'll set the roto node to replace. I'll connect it to the A input of my merge. And now I'll just mask around the balm. And give it some feather just to be sure. So our intent is to destroy things, not really to make things disappear. So I'll make another roto node here. Using the original plate again. And what I'll do now is sort of draw out this destruction looking shape. Something like this. And let's include this shadow as well. Check replace again. You don't necessarily need it here actually, but it's a good practice since it will just replace the alpha with the shapes we just made, which is what we need in this case. I'll create a pre-mold and merge it back over to where I removed the balm. Okay, now let's fix these empty spaces using the roto paint node. Clone stamp, set this to all so it's affecting all frames. And now I'll just quickly paint this out. Now I actually want to create another layer, so I'll create another roto node. I'll actually connect it up to the roto paint one. Move this over a bit, another merge, replace, pre-mold. And in this roto node I'm going to sort of draw the inside of my exploded balm. And before this pre-melt, I'll put a grade and make it a bit darker. So it looks like it's at different depths. I'll actually organize this a bit differently by merging it here and then here. This way I can easily put another roto paint node over here. This time I'll take the brush, set it to all again. Make the size just 1 pixel. You can change the size by holding shift and left mouse dragging. And now I'll just sort of paint in some light detail. And I'll take the opacity way down on that. So to finish this off, I'll add some more displacement. Turn the size way down. And the amount as well. And I'll add a little bit more detail, which is just the amount of octaves in the noise. I don't like the distortion in the shadows, so I'll add a rotor node and connect it to the mask input of my displacement gizmo. And I'll just quickly mask the top part out. Okay, looking pretty cool. Now another cool thing I want to add to the ground is this burn mark. You can actually get this one for free from actionvfx.com. I'll create a grade node and plug this burn mark PNG into the mask. Let's get out of our alpha viewer. So first I need to take the gain down to get a dark burn mark. So I'll just select the bomb color again. Now let's move this around using a corner pin. So what I'll do here is just use the corner pin to get the perspective right. And then I'll use a transform node before the corner pin to move it around. Now I actually want my exploded bomb to go over the burn mark. So I'll select these, disconnect them, and put them before our destroyed bomb. Now we get the problem with the shadow, so to fix that we can go to the rotor node, select the shadow shape, right click here and select cut. Then go to the mask we use for this clean plate, right click here, select paste, select it, and then in the shape tab set it to black. We should add the shadow back in. Oh, we have to move it above the ellipse, of course. I think the color of this burn mark might be a bit too different compared to the dark color of the bomb. So I'll check my red channel first by hitting R in the viewport. Adjust my red gain, then the green channel, the blue channel. Especially that one was way too dark, I see. That's better, a bit too much blue, I guess. Okay, I'll multiply that down again a bit. And it's a bit too sharp, I think, so I'll add a blur to it, set it to 2, mix it down to 0.7, I think. And I'll actually add that to the bomb here as well. And I actually don't really like these highlights I made on the left side, so I'll erase those using the eraser. Don't forget to set this to all. Now it also might be fun to animate this burn mark over a couple frames. So I'll go 1 frame back, set the scale to 0, set a key, then 3 frames later I'll set it to 1. Now let's create a backdrop around this. I'll call it exploded bomb. Now the reason I branched it off like this is that I now easily can go in here, create a switch node. And then on the explosion frames I can set it from 0 to 1. So I'll set it to 1 here, and 1 frame back I'll set it to 0. It seems like our debris is actually showing too early on this frame, so let's animate that merge as well. So now I'm finished with the compositing. Let's create a write node and export this to EXR so we can finish this shot up in After Effects. So for exporting a file in Nuke, you need to put the hashes in the same amount of digits you have here. So in our case it's 3. And then I'll add .exr to it. Next up, we need to make sure that our export color space is the same as our import color space, which in our case is linear. So our export needs to be linear as well, which it is, so that's nice. And I'll leave the other settings as they are in this case. I don't really mind the compression since I'm exporting to MP4 at the end anyway. And don't forget to set your frame range correctly, which in our case it already is, but sometimes you have to set it to global or have to type it in here manually. Now let's render our composite. So with our render loaded into After Effects now, the first thing I'll do is add some grading. So Ctrl Alt Y to make an adjustment layer, add the curves effect. I'm using Effects Console from Video Copilot by the way for this, but you can also get there by going Effects, Color Correction, Curves, and I'll basically just sort of move the gamma down. Then I'll add another adjustment layer, because I feel like this bottom part is just sort of too bright. So I'll mask this out, add another curves, and tone that down even more. Take some of that blue out. Let's feather this. Okay, so that will be our grade. Next I'm going to look at my framing. So let's make sure the bomb is right there in the middle, which it isn't now. And I also want to level this a bit better, I think. So I'll just transform our base layer. But first I'll actually parent this adjustment layer to it, since the mask in there should move along with it. So let's zoom in a bit. So let's use this tool to move our pivot to the center of the bomb. Now align it with the center here. Hit S to go to scale and scale those borders out. And R for rotate to slightly rotate it to make the horizon more leveled. Next I want to add a bit of a camera shake, so I'll go to the frame just before the explosion. And I'll actually zoom in a bit more to give me some more room to move this. And I'll hit P for position. Then I'll move like 2 frames ahead and move this layer down. And I'll turn on motion blur for that, of course. And to really finish this off, let's add a lens flare to it. So I'll create a black solid and call it Lensflare. I'll add optical flares to it from Video Copilot. So for the blending mode of this layer, we'll have to set it to add. To get to the blending mode, you can just hit F4. Next I'll add the tritone effect to turn it orange. And set a keyframe on the XY position and move it over to roughly the middle of my explosion. I'll turn this grid off now, by the way. So let's roughly animate this flare position to go along with the explosion. And let's animate the scale as well. I'll set it to 0 here, set a keyframe. I also need it to be 0 here, of course, so I'll add another keyframe like this. Then at this frame we have to turn it way up. And then turn it down again a couple of frames later. And with that we have our finished shot. Thanks for watching this tutorial and good luck making awesome shots using EmberGen.